Let us start here. I'd like to have a chat about multi-regional evolution. And to depict it easily, I'm going to just borrow somebody else's chart. I think it does it quite well. But I want to start with the point that when we look at human ancestry and we look at the pattern of human uh, uh, divergence and movement around the world, humans took many routes. This is not working for me. What am I doing wrong? I want to advance my slide.
The ownership of your slides
I
uh,
want to advance. I want to go to
by
the next slide.
clicking on the three dots next to your name at top of your slide.
Next to my name. Oh, here, I see. Three dots.
Yes,
Okay. Take ownership.
and
I've taken
yeah,
ownership.
and now
And
you
how do
can
I
at the
see?
bottom. Yes,
Here, yeah,
okay.
wrong way. Oh, right way. Okay. This is to make a point, and that is there were many human migrations, many human dispersals. None of them were one way. Our history of dispersals and population contacts is complex, and it involved population movements in many directions. I think that it is more useful to think about our history that way rather than think about them as waves of migration coming out of Africa and going to other continents. It was never one way. The key, one more thing, I am going to do this a little differently than I've seen others do it. I want to make sure that my English is as understood as it can be. So I'm going to read words I'm going to say, and we'll read them slow enough that people can, if you know some English, you might be able to translate this. I hope so. I hope this translator. We'll see. The key evolutionary issue raised by humanity's dispersal is how human populations diverged, while at the same time, evolutionary changes ended up everywhere. The fact is the fact that this pattern existed at all suggests the possibility. So I've stopped because I forgot how to make these slides advance here. Yeah, suggests the possibility that far into the past there was a single human species, Homo sapiens, just as there is today. The species concept existed long before evolution was understood. Species were a typological idea, different kinds of biological beings, platonic entities, if you will, that were immutable because each represented the ideal type for an animal or plant variety. Before Darwin, in the late 18th and into the 19th centuries, human races were widely considered by leading natural historians, who were scientists of their time, to be different species, created separately by God and therefore having different origins. This was called polygenism, and a depiction of polygenism by Professor Knott, writing in 1854, is shown here. The idea that we're looking at is that different apes became different human species. I'm sorry to take so long for this because I'm still. Oh, yeah, here we go. Sorry. Okay. With the acceptance of Darwinism, attention shifted from separate creations of races to their independent evolution. And that changes the way people looked at the pattern of evolution, the way they looked at polygenism. Turning to anthropology, this is a large site from the beginning of the Pleistocene. It's from Georgia. The site's name is Dmanisi. I picked it because A, is a very well represented site as far as crania are concerned and some postcranial remains. And B, we know its age. It's about the age of Oldoway Gorge. It shows, in particular, variation. These crania differ not because of time and not because of place, but because of different populations and because of sex differences. Okay. By the 20th century, what was polygenism became evolutionary polygenism, the idea that human races were different subspecies evolving in parallel to each other with little or no contact, whose origins were increasingly thought to be geographically dispersed groups of Homo erectus. The key element in these ideas is that the independent evolution of human races was for so long that they acquired their humanity separately. The most influential of the evolutionary polygenists was Ernst Haeckel, shown here. He was really a man of the 19th century, and he was responsible for many of the views that have persisted about the pattern of human evolution. Haeckel expressed his views as trees of human races and how they related to each other. The tree idea is a theory of unique descent where each race is a branch. Haeckel's tree, in fact, was racist. He provided diagrams of what he thought evolutionary stages looked like in the evolution of humans and other primates. He chose to pick a black African living in a tree with other primates. Uh, I think certainly he chose it for two reasons. One is that he considered black Africans to be the most primitive of human races, which for him meant the least evolved. Second of all, he was a racist. He described human races as different as primate species were. And I'm going to show this here by taking two of his diagrams and just laying them side by side. He never presented these side by side, but I think it shows you pretty clearly what he was thinking about. On the left is a diagram of primate evolution, starting with the most primitive primates in the upper left and the most advanced human-like primates in the lower right. To the right are human races, starting with the most primitive races in the lower right and the most advanced in the upper left. Makes it hard to compare them, but the point is that he did compare them because he thought the same process was going on. The direction of these arrows shows you the way he was thinking about it. And on the upper right is the most advanced of the Europeans, and that happens to be him. I did that. He had a religious figure up there, but I'm sure Haeckel thought of himself as being a quite advanced scholar. Haeckel argued that the mechanism of racial evolution was a competition between the races, a precept that was later to show up in Mein Kampf, Hitler's writings. Was Hitler a Darwinian? This is an often debated point, often debated contention, I should say, which today still has a lot of life to it. And people have not made up their minds about how they thought about this. But I would say myself that Hitler was a Haeckelian. It was Haeckel's thinking that he followed. Haeckel's interpretation of Darwinism was based on competition between races. In contrast, the competition between individuals. It was just a theory. What could possibly go wrong? Well, in the words of H.L. Mencken, who is one of my favorite authors, for every difficult problem, there's a solution that's simple, neat, and wrong. For many earlier paleoanthropologists, that solution was evolutionary polygenism, and we recognize it today as wrong. There is another way of looking at human evolution. For understanding the evolution of human populations and depicting their relationships, didn't mean to do that, and depicting their relationships, there's an alternative that's neither evolutionary polygenism nor the replacement of one species by another, as might be depicted by an evolutionary tree. Or I should say could be depicted that way. Franz Weidenreich, who lived mostly in the 20th century, concluded that human evolution took place within what today we would call an evolving evolutionary lineage, a line of descent. He was no polygenist and did not posit that the human races in this lineage were evolving independently of each other. What he wrote was this: if the hominidae are one species in the genetical sense, and an exchange of genes was possible throughout their evolution, the commonly used form to represent their lineage gives an entirely wrong idea. The tree, with its common stem and more or less abundant ramifications, that is, branches, leaves no possibility to indicate graphically an exchange of genes. The branches and sub-branches appear to evolve completely independent of each other once they have deviated. That's not what he thought happened. In reality, he wrote further, there must have been intercommunications between the branches. The graph that best fits this perception is a network. Its interconnections indicate that the lines along which gene exchange could be effectuated, because he felt that the genic exchanges between populations was the most important driving force in human evolution. By 1939, Weidenreich had worked across Europe and extended his researches into Asia, both North Asia and China, and South Asia and Indonesia. He was familiar with the details of human evolution all along the eastern edge of the Middle Pleistocene hominid range, from China to Southeast Asia. And he recognized that there were resemblances between ancient and modern inhabitants in both regions of Eastern Asia. He described a new model of human evolution in a collection of essays. In it, he rejected Haeckel's idea that the similarities were the result of parallel evolution of isolated subspecies. That made him unpopular. His explanation was complicated. It was sophisticated. It was also hard to follow because it was complicated and sophisticated. Again, quoting him, at least one line leads from Pithecanthropus, his name for Java man, and Homo soloensis, his name for the Nandong remains that were much later. That line leads to the Australian Aborigines of today. The key point, the complex one, is that this does not mean, of course, that I believe all the Australians of today can be traced back to Pithecanthropus, or that they are the sole descendant of a line from Pithecanthropus to Homo soloensis. It was more complex. The tree versus the network models summarize the intellectual fires that brought typology to a boil at the 1950 Cold Spring Harbor Symposium on Quantitative Biology. This was an important one. It was important because it was the first really significant meeting of biological anthropologists, paleontologists, and geneticists to try to work out a good model for understanding how humans evolved. They discussed the tree versus the network models, and they came to the conclusion that neither was by themselves enough to explain what they were seeing. This work was inspired by the developing evolutionary synthesis, which became predominant over the next several decades in evolutionary studies. Multi-regional evolution, as we conceived of it, is the child of the evolutionary synthesis that emphasizes intermixture in the presence of natural selection. Here are the three authors of multi-regional evolution. It's myself, Wu Xinxi, and Alan Thorne. We could not have developed this, each one of us, on our own. I'm sure it's true because I lived through this development. We knew each other, we met each other. We were only one time in the same place at the same time, but pairs of us were often at the same place. And we got to talk and to discuss the model that we were developing to try to explain the pattern of human evolution. I was particularly grateful to the National Academies of Science, whose grants let me travel to East Asia. What we developed is a reflection of Weidenreich's reticulating interpretation, but is based on modern evolutionary principles as developed within the evolutionary synthesis. The human species, as we understand it now, evolved in Africa. It expanded and it began to disperse late in the Pliocene, roughly 2.5 million years ago. Our insight, what we brought to this, was that the evolving human populations remain linked by the initial and continuing geographic dispersals and gene flow between populations. Once it started, it never stopped. As humans increasingly met and mixed with the peoples that they encountered. Today, we know from genetic studies that significant mixture of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other ancient human populations reflected a multi-regional pattern. And by the significant mixing that they underwent, all of these became Homo sapiens, a species with significant population structure. And this shows, this is almost 10 years old now. This shows the results of genetic studies quite some time ago, indicating that specific genes that we can understand come from some populations ended up in others. We know when that happened, we know where it happened, and today the picture we have is much more complex, but it's the same in structure. And in particular, because we knew about Denisovans and Neanderthals particularly well then, in 2016, when this was published, we had a pretty good idea of where things were going and where they were leaving. Mixture is everything in this pattern. Our President Obama once referred to himself as a mutt, which is a description of a mix of dog breeds. In fact, the realization of multi-regional evolution is that we're all mutts. We're all mixtures. It's likely that for most of the Pleistocene, half or more of the human species lived in Africa. And by some estimates, the African percentage was even higher. The population expansions at the end of the Pleistocene reflected extensive population size growth all across the inhabited world. The growth of the human population, in other words, accelerated through the Pleistocene and really accelerated in the last 50,000 years. Oh, I messed that up, sorry. More people meant more mutations. And this in turn meant the adaptive changes that brought advantages as they dispersed throughout the human range. The adaptive changes that spread and were important in the future history of our species, in other words, in how we became us. Sorry, I'll get the hang of this eventually. I know I will. When I say dispersal, this is an example of what I mean by dispersal. Here, what I'm showing is how populations spread across Africa, exchanging genes with their neighbors, and as the population density grew, the amount of genic exchanges increased until it became more and more of a driving force of evolutionary change. And what that led to was a combination of evolutionary change that involved all human populations and evolutionary change that was specific to regions. That is to say, somehow East Asians continued to have many features of East Asians, although some of those characteristics spread to other regions. That's the genic exchanges. Europeans, to the right, continued to have European features, even as Neanderthals evolved into more recent human populations in Europe. And Asians from the northern part of the continent, which is to the left, show that characteristics that were common early on remained common later. So, what I'm addressing here, what we've tried to address in our multi regional thinking, is how it came to be that as populations spread and became more broadly spread out and more modern in their general features, also retained regional features that were present from early on. One might think of that as a contradiction. We thought of it as a problem to be explained. I will learn this. I'm doing my best. I'm failing. Why is this happening? Okay. I apologize. Coming to here, there were significant worldwide changes, especially in the later part of the Pleistocene. And these involved features and behaviors that were adaptively important. I'm going to give you two examples of them. One was an increase in brain size that occurred all across the human range. This is a diagram of all the cranial capacities that were known from the fossil record. I would say probably 4 years ago. I don't have the very most recent ones up. It's everything that we think is in genus Homo, and it does not include the last 50,000 years, which would be a very large range of variation because there are so many fossils from the last 50,000 years. So let's call it 1.9 million years ago to 50,000 years ago. And the obvious thing that happens is human brain size increases. And it happens in all populations. This is a worldwide sample. For the opposite trend, molar size decreases. Same period of time. This is a much older chart. This actually comes from my dissertation, which was a 1957, 8, 9, 1957, 8, 1958 dissertation. See, I'm like the politicians here. I can't remember the date of my I can't remember the date of my dissertation. The direction of change is opposite. And what's important about that is only this, is that if you thought that the increase in brain size was from increasing body size, you can't also think that the decrease in tooth size, molar size, is also from increasing body size. It would have to be from decreasing body size, and that doesn't happen at the same time. So we have different evolutionary trends for different reasons. And this is what we came to understand was important and the changes that characterized all of humanity. In the very latest Pleistocene, toward its end and into the Neolithic, this global populational structure was increasingly obscured as dramatic population growth and expansion with concurrent dispersals and many population extinctions came to characterize the complex human species and create the world we live in. This really last part of human evolution is the last 50,000 years, when populations accelerated their size increase. Size increases, in fact, continue to the present. You've seen the graphs. Populations in the last 200 years have significant increase in size. And that led to increasing contacts between populations and increasing mixture, something that had been going on all throughout human evolution, but that accelerated. With larger, ever-growing population sizes, there are more mutations, and throughout the late Pleistocene, the rate of human evolution has been increasing. In fact, Evolution has been accelerating to the present day. This is quite different than the way I learned it eons ago when I took courses in human evolution. The courses I took were wrong. The understandings of human evolution in the mid 19th century turned out not to be correct. It's not been something that stopped, it's been something that has increased in its magnitude of change. Evolution has neither slowed nor stopped. Key message. Thank you. And thanks to the organizers for inviting me to come.